Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today because I think it's important to state that this motion is one of the most important that this Parliament has ever had to deal with, because today we are asked to rush through the study of a bill that is very important for the future of Canada Post workers, but also for the future of all Canadian workers. This bill, if it is agreed to by this House, will be a rollback of decades of work for Canadian unions. It will trample on the legitimate right of workers to negotiate their working conditions. This right has been the subject of a fight for many, many years in the history of our Canadian labour law. The situation is this. Rotating strikes began on June 2nd, 2011 at 11:59. There were to be no consequences in terms of the sending and receiving of government checks to minimize possible negative consequences on the public, despite the fact that they were under no legal obligation to do this at Canada Post. The Labour Minister said on June 14th in the morning that a return to work legislation was not necessary because it was rotating strikes and that the delivery of mail would continue. And on June 15, 2011, she said that she had received very few complaints regarding these rotating strikes. On June 14, 2011, in the evening, saying that there had been $100 million in financial losses for the employer, this Crown Corporation chose to lock these workers out, despite the fact that rotating strikes were continuing to ensure that service delivery. This government decided that mail stoppage had lasted too long and decided to impose a return to work on Canada Post employees merely one day after the beginning of the lockout that they themselves created, claiming that this was in the superior interest of the Canadian economy. Worse yet, this government's bill provides in working conditions far worse than what had been offered in the last agreement with management. The arbitrator will have to decide on one or the other of these positions. There's no gray zone. It's going to be black or white. This might lead to an incredibly dangerous precedent in the history of Canadian workers, forcing Canadian workers to go back to work with conditions worse than what they had received from their employer. We see how important this bill is, and it is a clear line that is being drawn in the sand. Today, we are hearing that there is a motion trying to expedite the debate so that this bill will again trample on the rights of workers, and on top of that, the government has the audacity to ask us to do this even more quickly. Given the importance of this bill, it's important, I think, to take the time to reflect on it, to ask ourselves the questions and wonder, how could this be possible if there is no possible adjournment? When we're talking about imposing working conditions, that could have disastrous consequences. I myself had to deal with the impacts of something similar in 2006 when I was working in the healthcare field in Quebec. I felt that was shocking. People who have no idea of what the work is like in the field, people who are experiencing this work on a daily basis, have a completely different experience. I completely lost trust in the government that took a decision that affected me. And this lack of trust remains. There's nothing worse for a worker to experience this. It's as though we were simply numbers in the system. And it's as though people forgot that behind these decisions there are people, men, women, mothers and fathers, young, motivated workers, and others, more experienced workers, who are proud of their jobs. Then you have forced back to work, and you're demotivated, and you get the sense that you have no hope because you are not really appreciated. You feel as though you're just a pawn in this game. Many nurses had to choose other options. They've focused on other types of work, doing something that they had not been allowed to do in the past. They were able to negotiate their working conditions. Private agencies have had disastrous effects on our healthcare system in Quebec. It's created astronomical cost increases for the system. Private employee companies have to deal with very different things than the public system workers have to deal with. Other conflicts erupted in these hospitals that I was working in. Hospitals had to turn to their own employees to then force them to take overnight shifts. What's the point of staying in the public system if you're going to have salary conditions that are lessened and inherit the worst conditions that you get from the private agency employees? When the collective agreement was negotiated in 2011, the Quebec government did not make the mistake of decreeing working conditions. There was a real negotiation. And little by little, the sense of being a part of something resumed. Damages caused to our healthcare system by the intrusion of private agencies will take a lot of time to heal. But these wounds would probably have been far worse if the government had acted in a different way. This bill seems to hide the desire to privatize Canada Post, in fact. This motion leads me to reflect on this matter. This bill may change the future of important corporation such as Canada Post. It is important to state that Canada Post is a very profitable corporation. $280 million worth of profits were accrued last year. If you look at the cost of sending a standard letter, it's currently 59 cents in Canada. Countries that have privatized their postal services have higher rates. In Germany, 77 cents. Austria, 88 cents. The Netherlands, 64 cents. Clearly, our public system is a winning one. If we turn towards a privatized system, what will happen is that competition will lead a number of big companies into the large urban centers, and there will be no one to deal with the rural and remote communities. Who will come to serve the people in my riding? No one. What company will come to Saint-Lambert de Meloise, Belle-Terre, Saint-Nazaire-de-Berry, and Bellecombe? No one. Why? Why won't they? Because it's just not worth it financially for them. Some senior citizens in my riding have decided to stay in their home and don't have a driver's license to get themselves from here to there. How will they have access to their mail? I will be voting against this bill. Also, I would like to say that it is an affront to the Quebec nation. If we wanted to celebrate our national holiday, does that have to come at the expense of Canada Post workers? I've already had to miss Saint-Jean-Baptiste celebrations to work at the hospital as a nurse, and I didn't mind so much because I felt that people who were ill needed me. Today, I know that Canada Post workers need members to stand up for their rights, like the NDP members, and I will be missing my Saint-Jean-Baptiste celebrations for them, and I don't mind because I know they need me.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As I said earlier to one of the other members, bargaining on this current contract began last October. Clearly the parties had a significant number of issues to discuss, but not the least amongst them is the fact that Canada Post business model is changing dramatically. In fact, many Canadians, if they live in an urban setting at all, if they have access to broadband internet, have found ways to largely replace a lot of the mail. And in fact, Canada Post's own numbers indicate that postal flows are dropping off fairly dramatically. I think that one of the things that really concerns me, and I wonder if it concerns the member, from the moment in time that the rotating strikes began, and then through the lockout, it's clear that Canadians and financial institutions and utility companies and otherwise have been encouraging people to get away from the mail and to move towards electronic statements. This is damaging the post office's long-term business structure, and I'm concerned that rural Canadians in my riding will then have to pay inflated prices for mail because Canada Post business model is being permanently damaged by this.
Honorable député.
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam Speaker, I'd like to point out to my colleague that despite the fact that there was an increase in internet usage to pay people's bills, I think there's a limit to things, and at some point, some things simply can't be done online. In my own riding, there are many, many people in my riding who don't even have access to high-speed internet. How could they possibly get their bills online?
The honourable member for Nanaimo Cowichan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the member for her very good presentation. I think sometimes in these discussions we forget the realities of people's lives, and I've got an email, and I won't read the whole email, from a worker in my riding, and this is the reality for some of these letter carriers. It says that letter carriers start out as temporary workers and are told that they are likely to be temporary for 3 to 5 years, but in Nanaimo, they're temporary for much longer. Mike has worked for Canada Post as a temporary letter carrier since 2004. He receives no paid vacation, no paid sick time, and no pension. Mostly he works full-time hours, but sometimes he finishes a work week and is told that there may not be work for him in the following week. In 2009, he spent 5 months in this situation, and out of that 5 months, he only worked 3 weeks. So, Madam Speaker, I wonder if the member could comment on the fact that often these letter carriers are in precarious employment and situations, and we need to do everything that we can to support workers in their right to bargain for fair and reasonable employment.
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Yes, indeed. I thank my colleague for her comment. Working conditions for postal workers are not that stable to begin with. I have one of my roommates who started working for Canada Post. It varied a lot at first. He had to work as a security guard, and he also had to work as a postal worker, and he just had to sort of juggle between the two. He never knew when he would be getting the call to work here or there. So I think negotiating this collective agreement this type of collective agreement could have allowed these workers not to have to experience this type of thing.
The honourable member for Oshawa. The honourable member for Oshawa.
And I want to thank the member for her speech, but I just heard one of her colleagues talk about reality. Well, I'd like to talk to her about the reality in my riding and some of the calls I'm getting at my office. I'm getting calls from seniors who are worried if this is prolonged and what effect it's going to have on their checks that they need. I'm getting calls from people with disabilities who are worried about having their checks delivered. I'm getting calls from small businesses who are relying on checks coming into their offices so they can pay their employees. We're just exiting one of the worst recessions in history. I want that member to tell my constituents, the people who are real to me, what is she going to say to them when they're depending on that postal service to provide jobs to my community? What's she going to say to them?
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue has 30 seconds to respond. Madam Speaker, during rotating strikes, there were really very few consequences for Canadian citizens. The government could have acted to prevent the lockout and prevent all of these Canadian citizens from being affected by these long wait times.